CB Robertson, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
You're one of those content creators, writers, authors on Instagram who's, I just keep bumping into, your material over and over again. Every time I read it, I'm like, this is on some level that I have so much admiration and respect for. And so when you messaged me, I think it was last week or the week before, we just kicked off a conversation about Christianity and had the chance to interact. I was like, oh, I got to take this opportunity to have this guy on the podcast because I just want to pick his brain and listen to him share about these topics that I myself am learning about.
Very cool. Oh, the feeling is very mutual. I feel like we've been running in very sort of similar circles, circumlocuting around each other for some time. I've been hanging out with a bunch of all groups, online Catholics in the Telegram world. And and of course we're both mutual acquaintances with Jack and his excellent body of work, and all things sort of online masculinity subject matter. And I think it's natural that religion and philosophy sort of go hand in hand with that realm of exploration.
Can I ask you a bit what it's like to hang out with the Catholics online? Like, how's that going? I myself am Protestant. I think I don't know too much about denominations, but I'm super curious what it's like in that world.
Sometimes it's rewarding. It was getting a little irritating. I haven't spent time there in a few weeks, but it was getting annoying dealing with the infighting, because there's nothing Catholics love more than dunking on Protestants.
Sure.
And there's nothing Orthodox Christians love more than dunking on Catholics. And it's very, it's funny. And of course you get outside of the Catholic world and everyone loves dunking on Christians in general.
Yep.
And then you go to church and Christians are dunking on Buddhists and atheists, which is not hard to do these days. And
yes.
It's all kinds of dunking everywhere. But Catholicism is interesting because there's such a deep body of work to explore there as well. And especially if you find people like Bishop Robert Barron, who's an excellent person to follow, no matter what your beliefs are, just in the way that he looks at things and analyzes things. So
that's
of the Christian groups, Catholics are particularly, they have a particularly likable contingent in them. I'll say that.
Yeah, I mean, as I've gone exploring through the world of Christianity, which admittedly hasn't been all that long, I've noticed some of the same dynamics that you describe of this group dunking on that group, that and it's it's interesting. Like, allegedly everyone's kind of on the same team, but they can't like miss the opportunity to take digs at each other almost every chance they get. And I will say that I've spent, I guess, the past 30 years of my life investigating religion and spirituality, as much as I can, as broadly as I can. And so I am actually quite interested to get into these philosophical, theological distinctions between Christian denominations. But from the outside, it's just kind of looking around at this and being like, what are you guys doing?
Oh, sure. Yeah. It's very easy. And I think there are actually some Christian criticisms of theology along the lines of, it's very easy to sort of miss the moon for the finger, as it were, and to completely lose track of the personality and spirit you're trying to develop by going to church and in pursuit of all these like arcane bits of trivial knowledge about the origins of the Nicene Creed or this or that heresy from the 3rd century or whatever, which is all fascinating and worth exploring. It's just easy to lose track of why you're getting into that stuff.
Yeah. How do you strip apart the practice, the history from the actual theology? Like, what is the actual, what are the nuances of the actual theological picture that are being described outside of any actions of men? Like, what are the actual mechanics of spirit that are going on, which is always what interests me, but that's a bit harder subject to get into.
Well, and maybe it's easier for me as a non-Christian to stay a little detached from from it, but it's no less enjoyable to learn about, and maybe that makes me strange, but it is easy to mistake the map for the terrain, as it were, with theology.
Yeah, it's like what are we actually doing here? What is it we're actually saying about ultimate reality and our place in it? You know, how do we actually like strip off the jerseys, of my team versus your team and say like, well, what does this actually say about the universe and our place? And
Yeah.
for people that
Aside from the fact, of course, that Catholics aren't real Christians and Mormons are even worse, and Orthobros are just LARPing, and every other denomination has its. Yeah. How quickly can we race to the bottom on this?
exactly. Yeah, well, I mean, I will say that there is a very fascinating. Again, I don't know too much about Orthodoxy, but it does seem to have a really strong appeal for men and masculinity these days. It seems to be this gravitational appeal almost. It's very interesting to see. I know of at least two or three guys I talk to per week, who've become Orthodox in the past couple of years, trying to find
Mm.
a version of Christianity that fits with them, that they feel like they can make a home in. And I personally, I found a great church to belong to, and I found a great pastor who gives me the spiritual nourishment I need. So for me, it's a bit more academic in that way, but it's at the same time, it's hard not to deny that kind of trend is what's happening.
Yeah, for sure. And Orthodoxy is particularly interesting because my introduction to Orthodoxy, to exploring Orthodoxy, was there's a somewhat infamous character in the pagan world named Paul Wagner, a bit of
Yes, I know
a,
Paul. I don't
a
know him
bit of
personally, but I know of him.
a bit of a cult leader, and I mean that in a not quite as a compliment, but as a neutral description. I think he would accept
Yeah.
the label, and specifically a wolf cult leader. But
Hmm.
he has said in the past that his dad um, is a Christian priest, and he
Hmm.
quit the Anglican Church to become an Orthodox priest because
Oh,
he felt that the Orthodox Church was the last bastion of real Christianity, and
okay.
has variously said that there aren't really substantive value differences between he and his brother and their pagan cult and their dad and his Orthodox beliefs. So I think that strange connection there is part of the attraction that a lot of men feel towards Orthodoxy. They see the hermetic cloaks with the strange kind of rune-ish signs on these black cloaks. It looks very old world, and it's the in many ways the aesthetic of Orthodoxy that draws many men in, as far
Hmm.
as I can tell.
And I agree with that assessment that it seems like I can't speak to the theology of it. I know that a lot of the guys that I know, the Catholics and the Orthodox guys, I know debate about, the Orthodox is the oldest church, and there's something going on with Ethiopia
Yeah.
and that whole thing. And I don't even get into that. But to your point, it does seem like the real appeal is the aesthetic, is the feeling of discipline, of rigor, of hierarchy, of structure. But I think also what Catholicism and Orthodoxy have is a sense of the numinous that doesn't actually exist in Protestantism in quite the same way. And I think for a lot of really mystically minded men or men who experience religion or experience spirituality in their hearts, which is a good thing, they're looking for
Mm-hmm.
something that reaches them on that level, and they don't really find it in Protestantism, which I can't really disagree with. You have to dig deeper for it. I'm not saying
Yeah.
that's a value judgment, but they want to see something that calls to their souls and spirits.
It's there in Protestantism, but it is more deeply buried.
Yes.
There isn't the body of work that there is with Orthodoxy or with Catholicism. Catholicism in particular. I mean, even the architecture of Catholicism leans into that sense
Hmm.
of the transcendent and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I've been to the Sagrada Familia Church in Barcelona, and to step inside, I've been to Barcelona twice, and the first time I went in 2004, it was closed, and when I went back in 2015, it was open, and to step inside that church was just it was I don't I lack words. It's just an overwhelming power of genius and majesty and beauty, like crushing transcendent beauty. It was really as close to stepping into a vision of heaven as I can imagine. That's not to say there aren't
Mm-hmm.
others, but as I could imagine it, and that a faith would
Right.
produce something of that scale, that drama and majesty is it's humbling. It's humbling, and I think that's the appeal of some of these ancient faiths, is that they offer that in a world that today, especially this dry box, gray, black mirrored, drained
Yeah.
of mysticism world we live in.
And so much of American Christianity in particular seems to be dressed up in IKEA instruction booklet style too.
Yes.
You know what I mean? It's very how can we dumb it down and make it kind and compassionate and compatible with not just worldly sensibilities, but the busy schedule of our attendance, and make it convenient to. And this is something you hear priests and preachers complain about all the time, about the sort of ongoing corruption of the spirit of the church. And this is true, no less true of paganism or Buddhism, or I'm sure any other religion, than it is of Christianity. But
Mm.
it's an ever present struggle between, will the dictates of day-to-day living alter our view of the transcendent and our relationship with it, or will it go the other way? Will our view of the transcendent alter how we live our lives in a
Mm.
day-to-day living? And so much of the and this is the thing that initially turned me off from Christianity in my youth and my high school years, was the unseriousness with which most of the attendants took this
Mm-hmm.
relationship with your all-loving divine creator. And
Mm-hmm.
this is like a pleasant thing to hear about on a Sunday over cups of coffee while socializing, and oh, thank goodness the kids are being taken care of for an hour and a half. Um,
Right.
it's like, it, you're not acting like you believe this.
Mm-hmm.
And one gets the sense that of this in the pagan world too. Some of the online Catholics are very fond of pointing out statistics correlating obesity with paganism. That's their favorite statistic.
Oh
Um,
man. Point to the Protestants, I'm sure that sure you overlaid that data, you
well,
would see
you
similar trends.
have to strategically combine denominations and then break them up to make things work out in your favor. But
Exactly. Yeah, no, there is, and this has actually been noticed in more denominations and more sections of Christianity than I realized. The unseriousness, the lack of commitment, the ungraspingness of, like, this is what we're actually doing. Like, do you understand, parishioner? What it is we're actually talking about here. And I've been reading many books and listening to lots of YouTube videos from a tight knit group of Protestant pastors who are actually beginning to address this. Michael Foster is a good example, Doug Wilson. And this past weekend at my church, the
Doug
pastor, Jeff
Wilson is
Durbin,
excellent.
yeah, he's awesome. The pastor, Jeff Durbin, gave a 75-minute sermon. So when he started Apologia Church 10 years ago, they started Matthew, and they've been working through the book of Matthew for 10 years. And just this past
Wow.
weekend, they got to the passion, that Jesus Christ's death on the cross after 10 years. So my buddy Sean, who I went with, pointed out that it's possible that Pastor Jeff has been working on this for 10 years, this speech for 10 years. I had tears in my eyes when it was over. Like, the picture that he painted, it was like a 75-minute sermon, just crushingly beautiful. I was in tears afterwards to really get a glimpse of the majesty of what was going on. And where do these churches exist that really paint the picture? It's not 15-minute motivational speech. It's, no, I'm going to open the heart of this text for you, which wasn't written for entertainment. It's not like
Yeah.
reading the Hunger Games or Harry Potter or even Dickens or anything like that. It's written in this very dry way. Let me open it to you so you can see it and really glimpse the majesty and the beauty of what we're talking about. And I feel it really lands for the people at this particular church, which is why I feel lucky that I found it, because I found the food that I need there.
Absolutely. And I feel like that touches on a broader cultural trend of shortening everything, simplifying everything.
Yeah.
One of my favorite bands, I'm sure I'll get comments for this, Tool, is
Yes, Tool.
famous for not just waiting 10 years between albums, but also
Right.
they put out these albums with like 10-minute songs, 12-minute
Yeah.
songs. And it takes time. It takes building to get to the point where the where you actually get the payoff of listening to the music. And that's the whole purpose of an album, as opposed to just
Mm-hmm.
listening to singles. And I get the increasing impression that we've always had these longer payoff, whether it's musical appreciation or spiritual development and religious, um, substance. It's always there, but it's always, in the background against a majority of short time horizon, quick return. Let's have a 2 minute pop song that makes me feel good, and I go about my day, talking to my spouse while texting, while doing, three other things at the same time, and never having to take time and sit down and focus and pay attention for any length of time, which is
Mm-hmm.
very convenient, but you miss out on that depth, and uh, true appreciation of deep beauty that takes time just to develop the taste for, let alone to put together.
Mm-hmm.
Um, which could arguably bring me to my favorite religious text, which is, I think possibly related to the Bible, but is the epic works of Homer,
Mm-hmm.
the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are
Excellent.
widely considered to be the greatest work of poetry ever, unsurpassed, um, many times imitated but never quite matched, and
Mm-hmm.
they're not short.
No.
um, they're not short, but well worth the read if you can take the time to read them, and even better if you take the time to learn how to read them.
Mm-hmm.
Which is very similar to the Bible, I would imagine. It's one thing to read the Bible cover to cover. It's another thing to read the Bible, accompanied with commentaries, accompanied with discussions, accompanied with exploring passages in depth, a la Kierkegaard, a la any sermon at any church on any Sunday
Mm-hmm.
in the country. And that, and I think that depth exists in the Iliad and the Odyssey, um, in much the same way, and can be explored in similar depth, but largely hasn't been. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Mostly because we're a predominantly Christian culture, and the Library of Alexandria burned down, so there's that too. So
Yeah, there's that. No big
yeah,
deal. Well, it's
yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up because I was on a long drive today and I was listening to an audiobook and I found I usually read print books, but I found my attention really strained. I'm driving, so I can't really do anything else but listen, which is good, but
Mm.
I find my attention wandering as I'm listening to this audiobook. It's like, oh, I can see the need for dopamine, just bringing my mind back to the
It's like a
the
muscle.
content. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Well, it's very much so. It was really tiring, like doing that. I got better at it and was able to absorb the information better. But one of the things the book was talking about, coincidentally, was the Aeneid, and he was talking about Homer as well, and the notion of piety and duty, and how piety is a word that we've
Mm.
lost. And it just struck me at the moment how limited my education in the Greek classics were. I mean, how limited. I did a whole podcast on Hamlet's "to be or not to be" soliloquy in my Poetry for Men series.
Excellent.
Yeah, I say with humility that it's one of the greatest things I've ever created. I'm very proud of it because I spent months on it trying to understand it because it wasn't given to me during my education. I had a great education. It still wasn't given to me. So if me growing up with the
Right.
benefit of one of the best educations in America was not exposed to the Greek classics in the way that I would have liked, and the way that I gather you have been, what hope is there for any generations that followed me? So the chance to talk to you today is actually fortuitous because there's so much that I want to learn, and you have this way of breaking down these classics in this really relatable way. I listened to your podcast about Plato's Republic, and I got it. Like, it doesn't mean I don't have to. It doesn't mean I don't have to read the thing, but at least I got the overall structure of it, and I got your point. So I was excited
Mm-hmm.
to talk to you to begin digging into some of these subjects. I know that you talk about them in The Hero and the Man, and online as well. So I'm very curious to hear more about Homer. I've read the Odyssey, of course, and read bits of the Iliad, but I'm curious to hear more about this because I think these subjects will have a lot to teach men about our modern world, even though it was thousands of years ago.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and one of the best books I think to read about the Iliad and the Odyssey, aside from mine, obviously,
Obviously.
much better than mine, is Why Homer Matters by Adam Nichols, and he has a joke in there about how basically everyone is uh, can be broken down into either an Iliad person or an Odyssey person. There are
I'm
some
not an
guys who
Odyssey
are
person.
really into the Iliad and other guys who are really into the Odyssey, and very, very rarely is someone like into both.
Hmm.
Um, and his dad was an Iliad person, and Adam was an Odyssey person. But
Hmm.
my whole purpose in writing The Hero and the Man is an argument I hadn't heard many other people make, and not in the way I made it, is that these two books are not separate stories. They're best understood in relation to each other and together. They're a package. Um,
Hmm.
as a Christian might say that the New and the Old Testament are a package, and you won't make sense of the New Testament without the Old, and vice versa.
Hmm.
Um, because they express a development from one character archetype to another, and both are mutually necessary for each other to exist. So it's not that like one is better than the other, although there is maybe a case that one is more desirable to be, but that doesn't mean that it can exist independently. And those are of derivatives of the first words of the two books respectively.
Hmm.
um I, Stop me if I start rambling here, but
I will
my
let you talk
favorite
for minutes and minutes. My
good,
listeners know
good.
that.
My favorite my current favorite philologist and Homeric scholar is a Harvard professor by the name of Greg Nagy, and
Could you spell that?
Nagy. So not
Okay.
exactly intuitive from the enunciation, but
Right.
um, many of his works are available online for free at the Center for Hellenic Studies, which is an excellent resource. But he makes the case that all of these poems follow almost like a modern copywriting format, where you have a headline that summarizes the story, and then there's a subtitle that gives you a little bit more details, and the first paragraph gives you a little bit more material, a little more substance explaining what's going on, and then you get into a more chronological account of what happened. And so in that manner, both the Iliad and the Odyssey begin, the first several lines, really the first word gives a summary of the theme of the story. And the
Hmm.
first lines elaborate on that theme, and then it goes into the story from there. And the first word of the Iliad is menin, it means wrath or divine sanction, as another Harvard philologist Leonard Molnar pointed out. And it's the wrath that inevitably follows a violation of the divine order,
Mm.
and it's variously alluded to even at the level of the gods themselves in the Iliad. But it happens at when Agamemnon refuses to accept a ransom for Chryseis. It happens when Achilles refuses Agamemnon's offer of reconciliation, and it happens over and over again. It's this repeated theme, but it all ties into heroes,
Hmm.
and it's what the Iliad is about fundamentally, is about heroes, and it's about the tragedy of heroes, and it's about what it means to be a hero
Hmm.
more than any other book, and it explains um, what being a hero means, and it explains that in the first few lines, where it says, sing, goddess, the wrath of Peleus' son Achilles, murderess who cast thousands of souls untimely to hell, but their bodies were left on the fields to be eaten by birds and dogs of prey. Strong, stout souls of heroes
Hmm.
to be eaten on the battlefield by dogs and birds. That's what a hero is about. That's what being as a hero is about. It's a doomed enterprise, but they are being sung about in this song that's remembered 2,800 years later.
Right.
Then is that a trade-off worth having? Well, some people say maybe it is. And so the Iliad but the price of that is perhaps incurring this wrath, this menace.
Mm-hmm.
And there are many instances in the Iliad in which this line daimoniisos is used, which is like a superhuman force or like a god. Like a character is described as being godlike in their carriage, in their fury, in the danger they impose to their enemies on the battle.
Mm-hmm.
And I think with one exception, in almost every case, that person is immediately killed. so the price of becoming like a god for a moment is
Mm.
death. And the heroic question is it worth it to be like a god for a minute and then die?
Mm.
And it's left sort of an open question. You can
Do I get
see
a
the
song?
costs. You can see the costs. Well, that's the promise,
If I
right?
get to be
That's
if I
the
if I get to be God for a minute and then I die, do I get a song? Because if I get a song,
Do you get
then
a song about you? Yes. Will
yeah,
they sing? One can only hope, and one has to participate in that culture too. Of course,
yeah,
we
of course.
see Achilles at one point when he's being approached to like, oh please Achilles, come back and fight for us. He's sitting there playing um, a song to himself about heroes of the past.
Hmm.
Um, and he is participating in the hero cult of his area and of his culture, the hero cult that gave rise to there being a culture in which he participated in and which motivated him to pursue this path as well.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the frame that introduces the Odyssey. And the Odyssey begins with the word andra, which means man. Man, sing to me, muse, of that man of twists and turns who traveled far and
Mm.
wide and saw many cities and came to know their minds and suffered many sufferings um, and eventually, of course, wound his way home, but not
Mm-hmm.
after having to endure a whole lot.
Yes.
And the man described there, this man of twists and turns, this very complicated man, as one translator put it, is a different archetype, a different view of the world, and a different view of language than the hero. Um,
Hmm.
and the argument I try to make is that you need heroes in order not just to defend your society. The original pre-Homeric meaning of hero was literally just protector. It was the guardian. He was the guy who went out and killed the lion that's trying to kill you and killed the cow and brought the meat back and killed the other person who was trying to kill your cow.
Mm-hmm.
He's the warrior basically. But Homer introduced this idea that a hero is someone who can become immortal after they die if they live in a heroic manner. And it's that immortality through the word, immortality through song and through poetry that Homer is summoning with the opening lines. Sing to me, muse, of that man, or
Mm-hmm.
of the wrath of Achilles.
Mm-hmm.
That is in question with the Odyssey. And I think my position, this is not my unique argument, many other people pointed this out in the past, is that Homer gives something like an answer in the Odyssey, but you have to make it to the Odyssey to see the answer in the Iliad. And that's when Odysseus descends into the underworld. He meets Achilles.
Mm-hmm.
And Achilles, they speak for a little while, and Achilles asks about how his son is doing and so forth. And Odysseus is like, I have no idea. I'm sorry. But Achilles very explicitly says, I would rather be a servant to a tenant farmer among the living than king of the dead. I'd rather be a slave to a slave,
Mm-hmm.
basically, in the
Mm-hmm.
it and be alive than be king of the dead in this heroic fashion, which is interestingly an exact inversion of what John Milton, who very intentionally emulated and attempted to imitate Homer's style, ascribed to Lucifer when he went down to hell and said, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. It's
Mm-hmm.
an exact inversion. And it gives some sense of answer to the question of, is the heroic aspiration of being remembered forever worth pursuing? And Achilles, after achieving it better than almost anyone else says the answer is no.
Mm-hmm.
So says Homer, who immortalized him anyways.
Right. Well, that sort of, I've got a couple different thoughts in my mind, but that sort of raises the question, though: is your desire to be heroic entirely about you? So, from Achilles' perspective, he's like, it's totally not worth it. But what Achilles has created in thousands of generations, and the heroism that he's inspired, that maybe has not led to that level. It's kind of hard to say. But yes, of course, from his perspective, no, it's not worth it. But
Yeah.
do you
But
know?
we
Yeah,
all
exactly.
benefited.
Exactly. So how do you keep that? How do you balance those equations? Perhaps you
Yeah.
can't.
There's this
Well,
great Nietzsche line where Nietzsche says that nature uses our impulses to get what it wants out of us, and we mistake what nature wants as what we want, and then we act on it and bring much misery on ourselves, but improve civilization the rest of the world through it.
this reminds me
And
of,
there might be something like that going on.
reminds me of Richard Dawkins, like the selfish gene. It's a similar kind of argument where he kind of puts a pin on what maybe Nietzsche might have meant by nature. It's like it's our genes, right? Sort of, it's reductionistic, and it, as all the
Yeah,
materialists are. But
yeah, but one might say it's not it genes might have a role to it, especially where being you know sexually aroused is concerned. People do all kinds of things against their own self-interest in that state. Um,
true,
but
true.
which benefit and create future generations. So, but there's also an ideological element here where we see these heroes played out either on film, or we hear stories about them on the fire, and we want to copy what they do, not necessarily understanding the significance of it. And
Mm-hmm.
so maybe not a gene per se, but a heroic, I don't want to use the word meme because that feels so
Right.
denigrating the grandiosity and the significance of the concept, but an idea, and working in the interest of the idea. And given that the idea will outlast you, is it such a bad bargain to hitch your life to that?
Mm-hmm.
It's an open question.
Well, this reminds me of discussions about like the flow state, like when you truly like elevate is the term that I use, but when you
Mm-hmm.
truly achieve the flow state in whatever you're doing, you are it's the Zen notion about non-doing. You are not doing, something is being done through you, and that is one of the most divine human experiences available. So when you are not doing and
Right.
something is being done through you, and I can process that all kinds of ways theologically, we'll just keep it the way it is. When something is being done through you, to live in that state in the moment of highest glory, of allowing, let's call it broadly, life to manifest through you and your actions, to become a willing portal that life can pour through in thought, word, and deed. I think that would be the transcendent experience of being the God. And
Yeah.
maybe, the men who are going for that moment don't know that that's what they're doing. They want the bare feeling. Maybe they don't have the conceptual knowledge to know that, like, I'm trying to allow God to manifest through me in this glorious moment. And so when framed that way, maybe it is worth it. Like, you get to actually
So
be a piece of God for a minute.
perhaps, but what you're describing actually, so what Achilles and a hero is going for is kleos, is the Greek word, and it's a word many people have written a lot about, and it's this idea of glory and
Mm-hmm.
personal glory.
Yeah.
I'm going to go out and kill a bunch of people on the battlefield, and everyone's going to remember me. And it's not just glory in the conventional sense. It also refers to the songs about glory. It refers to the songs that people write glorying in your actions.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Poems like the Iliad, for example.
Right. Yes.
And what you're describing in this flow state, which you, from a Christian perspective, are framing in a manner of connection with God, actually ties into a different uh, aspiration entirely, one we see in the Odyssey, which is nous. Nous is
Mm.
mental connection with a an insinuation also of mental ability. It's sort of Odysseus's superpower. It's his
Mm-hmm.
ability to read people and connect with them and you could call it empathy, but that word's been kind of butchered in the last decade.
Just a
Um,
little bit.
just mildly, and
Yeah.
and that mental connection literally transforms him into different people, and it transforms his son Telemachus when his
Hmm.
son mentally connects with his father, and it transforms his father Laertes to the point where when Laertes comes out of a bath after having been reunited with his son, he went from being this beggar state person to coming out like a god, and in this case like a god doesn't precede being killed.
Hmm.
So and that mental connection, I imagine that most Christians are not pursuing their faith for personal glory. They're pursuing it for this state of mental connection, or I guess theologically, reconnection
Hmm.
after a historical disconnection.
Hmm.
Um, can't speak personally, obviously, but
Sure.
the experience you're describing there is something that that Odysseus strives for, and the argument that I think is unique to me, um, and that makes it all infinitely more complicated and interesting, is the role that language plays in both of these aspirations. How are you going to be remembered forever through a language as mercurial and subjective as language? What's
Right.
that memory going to look like after a few telephone games through the ages? Is the
Hmm.
story we're reading called the Iliad, which is one English translation from a Greek book that wasn't even written in a version of Greek that was ever spoken?
Mm.
Does that accurately convey what was going on? Is
Right.
our version Achilles the same as Achilles, who lived 1200 BC? And it becomes no less of a challenge with the question of nulls. How do you communicate? How can you really mentally connect with other people through language, or perhaps not through language, um, across time, or from a human to a god, perhaps? Uh, Challenging enough as it is just with family members,
Hmm.
sometimes just with communicating with yourself.
Your
Um,
girlfriend, your wife. Like, that's not what I
exactly,
said. That's not what I meant.
exactly.
Yeah.
Hmm. Right.
And yet
So,
some, go ahead. Sorry.
oh no, no, go ahead.
Well, and yet that's the thing, that's the paradox, right? Because when you actually break down language, how is it possible that you and I are actually having a conversation right now? Because the word,
Yeah.
the meaning, the felt sense perception of the meaning of a word, and all of its neural networking kind of sub meanings to me and associations, I have to condense all of that down into single sounds that I've been broadcast to you, that just now going through the internet, which are arriving to you and
Right.
being unpacked by you, and you're responding to me. How does it even work? But and that's on
Yes.
a day-to-day level. What we're talking about is on the historical level, where some guy who may or may not have been named Homer wrote this thing that about an event that may or may not have transpired in the way that it did, and now we're translating it into a language that hadn't even come close to existing, in any sense way back then. And now here we are in a world that looks nothing like it did back then, and that something is being communicated across those thousands of years. How does
Exactly.
that
Yes.
even happen in a way that inspires and motivates?
Well, and this is the great thing about heroes,
Yeah.
is in their extremity, in their memorable extremity, they become they become icons for their features that make them memorable. And so you can be swift-footed like Achilles, for example, or angry like Achilles. You can be complicated like Odysseus. And the great thing about heroes and the stories that we inevitably tell about heroes, and this is perhaps the greatest value that Homer gave to us, and it sounds like an underselling of his work. It sounds like a dramatic underselling of the importance of his work until you grasp this language thing, is that he provided us with language to talk to each other in. You could, I've heard many scholars say that Homer was in many ways the author of unified Greece, because it gave them all a shared story.
Mm.
It gave them a
Hmm.
place in the same story and a way to relate to each other, which in turn became, uh, in some ways, the author of Europe, or the story of Europe.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
knights the medieval knights trace their chivalric ideals back to 9 great warriors: 3 Christians, 3 Jews, and 3 pagans. And the first of those pagans, and as well as chronologically the first of all of these knights that they derived their chivalric values from, was Hector,
Mm-hmm.
the great defender of Troy. And
Yeah.
so this book, the Iliad, in a sense, set the tone for all of European chivalry and the warrior tradition of Europe.
Wow. Wow.
And was able to do that because of the power of that heroic story, because of those bodies being eaten by the birds on the battlefield.
Mm-hmm. And I think also that they could see something of themselves. They could see something of themselves represented in it. Like, so there's the thing
Right.
as itself. Like, you look at Achilles and he is the man that he is, or Hector, and they've done the things that Agamemnon, all of them, they've done the things that they've done, and that stands alone as something independent from the individual perceiving. But then there's
Right.
also some mirroring quality where it's like I look and I see something of myself reflected in that person in a powerful way that draws it out of me, that calls me forth to action, to act in emulation
Yes.
of that, but not to be him specifically.
Yes, exactly. And that I have a chapter in there on hero cults and cultic initiation. And cult has acquired obviously a very, very
Sure.
negative connotation in the last 50 years. I'm using it. I'm trying to use it in a more anthropological sense here.
Sure. Yes.
Um, and what you have in all of these cult initiation rituals of the past was a reenactment of some
Mm-hmm.
sort, where young people, usually young men, would participate in some behavior that reenacted the actions of heroes who were held in esteem. So in Greece, that was the dramas, the tragedies in particular.
Mm-hmm.
There would be a chorus, which we think of in songs as like, oh, that's the part that the crowd can sing along to, which is kind of true. And
Yes.
it was the original purpose, because that's the part that the youth participants who were being inducted into the hero cults of their locale would say. And it was often much more participatory than just repeating some bridge or some repeated, emotionally punchy lines from a song. They were participating in a conversation as if they were that person. It's a sort
Mm-hmm.
of first person film experience of you acting out, a
Mm-hmm.
gold medal recipient or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And you just for variety's sake, I included some northern examples too. There is a among the Germanic tribes of the north around the Roman era, young men would dress up in black body paint when they went on raids. And the Romans believed this to be a terror tactic, a way to intimidate enemies. But later historians, one in particular, Chris Kershaw, was like, that seems really unlikely because they did this repeatedly and to each other, and often in broad daylight. And it was it wasn't about scaring people, even though that might be a nice effect. It was about them literally taking on the identity of the dead
Mm-hmm.
and then go out, try to kill someone or steal some horses or whatever, as your heroic ancestors had. And so it
Mm-hmm.
was an initiatory rite of passage where you take on another identity associated with that hero in order to become a part of the tribe and connected to the rest of the community through this common shared story that you don't only know, but have actually lived to some degree. And that seemed to be the best hope to gain the benefits from the heroes, and to keep them alive as well, to keep those heroes who had died centuries ago alive and thriving in the present, without having to pay the price yourself for it,
Mm-hmm. Well,
or
you
at
get
least
to.
not intentionally.
Yes. Well, that's not the goal of it. Well,
Right. Yeah.
hopefully you don't have that be your fate. But I've participated in a ritual at a men's group, a men's retreat that did something similar with ashes. I don't want to disclose which one it was because it's a big part of the thing, but
Right.
it was a really powerful moment. These ashes were derived from a particular place, and there was a whole process. And the application of the ashes, it wasn't a lot of ash. It was, was like not even a handful, a couple fingers full, just putting it on the face. The
Right.
application of that ash was yeah, yes, of course, anyone looking at it might have a very intimidating kind of effect, right? As you say, but the subjective experience, my subjective experience of it was to bind me across space and time to brothers and men that I would never meet and never know, but it made me part of something. And it was a very
Yes.
powerful, it was very, very powerful. I found, and here's a group of 50 or 60 guys who had been strangers not hours earlier or the day before, I guess, participating in this ritual and suddenly becoming this unified whole in pursuit of a mission. It's a very real
Yes.
phenomenon.
Exactly. I'm reminded Yukio Mishima has this line in Sun and Steel where he's describing this experience of being um, someone who carried a divan or some other sort of carriage object in a festival. And it was
Mm-hmm.
these group of strong men who were carrying this very heavy object, the four of them. And he said it was this exhausting but almost euphoric experience. And he says, when these men look up at the blue sky, they see a different sky than everyone else sees. And you
Mm-hmm.
can't communicate that, but they all know it each other. And it's the formation of those kinds of experiences, I think, that form the foundation of that nous, that mental connection that we can, that permits us to speak to each other and understand each other. And we kind of hope that
Hmm.
we can do that by language alone. One gets the sense that, to bring it back to something you mentioned earlier, um, one gets the sense that Plato was trying to do that with the Republic, to begin from the ground up. Can I form a complete, um, you know, education, essentially a complete path out of childhood and into wisdom by creating my own mental connection. I'm still exploring the
Hmm.
Republic myself, so that's don't take that as a fact. It's more
Sure.
speculation.
Yeah.
But yeah, the creation of those shared experiences and the a common footwork, common reference for what we mean when we say a word as heavily baggaged as, for example, logos.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Yeah.
you get two people from different academic backgrounds, you are not going to have a common understanding of something like what that means.
Not happening.
It's hard enough to have common ground on what it means to be something as simple and straightforward as a man these days.
Yes.
Um, and so some of these deeper things, which we associate with the higher levels of meaning and more important, I forget who it was. Infinite Jest. David Foster Wallace famously
Mm-hmm.
said, "We're all divergent in our areas of our highest appreciations of beauty and talent and skill, and we're all common in our matters of crass humor and appreciation," which is why television and music tend to be so low at the radio and public consumption level. But we can still appreciate the high things, but it takes a degree of mental connection that is so difficult to do at a national scale, even between two people sometimes.
I think I just had an interesting thought in response to that. This may be what you're saying. So I was sort of giving the example earlier of me taking all these different concepts in my mind and condensing them into words and then speaking them to you and then you unpacking them, and how does that whole magical process take place just between two
Right.
individuals. And I guess I was being a little reductionistic with it in a way, because there's the content of the communication, the actual words and the meaning. But what if, and this may be what you're saying, what if our ability to communicate, or any two people's ability to communicate effectively, particularly two men, let's reduce it to men, to communicate effectively, is a product in some sense of the similarities of the suffering they both have been through. So you were talking about these Japanese men carrying the float. It's like they would have this bond of, we've suffered in this particular way, so that when I say
Yes.
this word, I know that that's what you mean. Or like two police officers or two soldiers or two sailors or something like that. If they have a common bond of shared suffering, even if they didn't do it together, they can communicate better than two men who have had, one man has had no suffering, et cetera, or completely mismatched in some way.
You
Maybe
know,
not
I had
totally mismatched.
I had never put that together before, but
Boom,
I'd
you
never
did
even
it.
thought of that association. But that is what Homer would say in the beginning of the Odyssey. The man who had suffered much was also the man who understood many minds of men.
Oh wow.
So
We just reverse
you're
engineer.
on point. You're on point there.
Sweet.
Suffering as the common. I would have said just experiences, but I think you're right because it's only with intense, memorable suffering that those get deeply ingrained. Um,
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite philosophers, a contemporary living philosophers, a gentleman named Matthew Crawford, once said, and I don't know if this is his original idea, I just heard it from him. This idea of learning that we don't really, it's not like we learn things when we're told them. And he
Right.
was using the example of automobile safety. Like someone will tell you some cue or some tip or trick to stay safer on a motorcycle, and you'll put it in your brain and be like, okay, and then you kind of ignore it. And then
Mm-hmm.
his close call theory was that you have to actually have a close call, some kind of near miss that's sufficiently traumatic that you remember it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when that cue that you were told about clicks. And it was there, but it wasn't really there
Mm-hmm.
fully. And then once you say, okay, I'm gonna always be careful if I can see my shadow in front of me, because that means other cars can't see me as a motorcyclist. And so
Mm-hmm.
I'm cruising along, and then I almost get, you know, head on collisioned by some car that drifted into my lane, and I freak out and I run over the ditch, and my pulse is racing, and I remember that cue, and I'm like, oh, got it now. And maybe I wasn't
Mm-hmm.
paying attention before, but in the future, I will be. Um, and maybe you need that kind of adrenaline kick in the butt, or that suffering in any capacity to kick it in place.
Mm-hmm. It's when the knowledge becomes embodied, like literally embodied. Like if you know something just in your
Mm-hmm.
head, and there's certain kinds of knowledge that you can only know in your head, like a truly advanced mathematics or physics. Like you can't know, I don't know these things. So maybe you can know them in your body, but it's a different example from what you're describing,
Yes.
which is like actual living in the world. Like in the world, someone can tell you everything you need to know about how to drive a car. But until you
If
get
it
in the car
didn't,
and you feel, go ahead.
yeah, if it didn't rewire your brain, did you really learn it?
Yeah, exactly. Well, one of the things I often talk about is I used to be a DJ, like a nightclub DJ, and
Oh,
it was
cool.
and yeah, I love that. I love doing it. I still love doing it. I don't do it anymore, but I was always very passionate about it. But one of the most interesting things that I had to learn when doing it is I could practice at home alone in my room, right? With my little speakers and whatever, just to learn the techniques and all that stuff. But to actually and to make this point, to actually get in a giant nightclub full of like 1,000 people and gigantic speakers, huge, massive bass bins, and to turn that on and to feel the massive amount of sound that's coming from every different direction. It's like the difference of what you're saying between theory and head knowledge and body knowledge, because it
Right.
becomes very physical very quickly. It's not
So,
like I can do all this. It's all in the body.
or maybe a difference between knowledge and skill, which
Yes.
is another
Yes.
way of putting it, because knowledge, the way that knowledge is framed today, and this is something that we hear a lot from the sort of scientifically literate credentialed establishment, is that knowledge, if it is knowledge, it's fungible by definition. But there are certain but
Can
there
you ever
are
know anything?
right but there are certain things that people can do that they can't just explain. They can't just transfer. I could go, learn from the best rock climber how to climb rocks, and he could explain everything to me.
Mm-hmm.
But that wouldn't, that it's a skill that he has and has developed, and a body knowledge, like you, the way you put it. And it's one of the other defining features of Odysseus, and one of the things that Homer spends a great deal of time dwelling on in both epics. Homer loves skill. Homer loves anything that is well
Mm-hmm.
done, and he takes the time to describe everything that is well done. Whether it's a man, Hephaestus smithing Achilles' armor in the 18th or 19th book, or if it's just the men setting sail and hoisting the mast and loading the cargo and everything, he'll take the time to describe the fact that they did it with expertise.
Mm.
um, and
Mm.
everything done excellently. And it's the sort of thing that you learn in the distinction between two modes of speech, really, that you see in the Iliad and the Odyssey. And it sort of ties in with Crawford's theory of learning. You have just the story, the direct, here's knowledge that I'm presenting to you. But I very loosely call that logos, which is just like
Mm-hmm.
reason or argument or the word most literally. But what we see in the parts of the Iliad, but more in depth in the Odyssey, is another mode of speech called einos. And einos is a cryptic mode of speech that's not designed to communicate something directly, but is designed to prime someone to see something differently in the future and to make a different choice in the future. And the hearer won't necessarily know what it is um, that they're hearing at the moment. They might be confused, or they might not be persuaded. But the
Mm-hmm.
hope is that, and you see this because it's always an older person speaking to a younger person in the context of Inos. It's
Mm-hmm.
always, they say, listen to what I have to say. Here's a sign, you can't miss it. And then they give some either metaphorical story, or they'll speak in some kind of strange riddle. And of course, the thing I discovered after re-diving back into the Republic, which you alluded to at the earlier, um, and I started diving back into it because it was related to Homer, and I hadn't read it in 10 years, so it was sort of a fresh look, is that it's one gigantic Inos. It might be the best Inos
Mm.
ever written.
Mm-hmm.
And the metaphor is this idea of a just city. The metaphor is this idea that we're talking about politics. We're talking about what should we censor? What should we allow in the city? How do we need to breed our warriors best? But it's all this very cryptic, um, hidden method of trying to guide the subject, the object of the conversation, really. A young man named Glaucon, who is actually Plato's brother. He's the son of
Mm-hmm.
Aristotle. They're both um, away from politics, away from the political life, and to become a private person who lives as a philosopher is the purpose. And
Mm-hmm.
it's actually very, very explicit when you look for that sign, because there are many, many signposts, which is a key part of the Inos mode, that indicate that it's about, the justice of a city is the same thing as the justice of a man, for example. They say that like dozens of times. And of course, the just city has to be led by a philosopher king, but the subjects need to be censored and their opinions need to be carefully guided. When you look at it literally, it all falls apart and makes no sense. And the
Right.
characters discover that, of course, in the text itself. But it's easy to forget that even when you're looking for it, because it's so long and because it's so detailed, and they get so enmeshed in the depth of their storytelling, which is, of course, part of the point, is to hide the intent from someone who doesn't necessarily want to be told what to do. Um, and of course, some of the great political philosophers of the last decade wrote whole books about Plato and misunderstood him because they didn't have that mental connection. I'm speaking mostly of Karl Popper here. Um, he wrote this book called The Open Society, which was dedicated in equal parts to taking down Plato and Hegel. And
Mm-hmm.
he believed that Plato's Republic was literal, even as Plato alludes to the Odyssey and the Iliad and talks about the choice of life that Achilles and Odysseus were offered as the purpose in book 1 and book 10 as the bookends of this giant story. And it maybe just goes to illustrate the importance of mental connection in not just our personal lives, but also in enjoying these classical works, which can be so enjoyable if you take the time.
So it sounds like I have not, I confess I haven't read the Republic. I've read some of read some of the dialogues, but not that particular one. So
Mm-hmm.
you know, however, when every time I hear it referenced, I do hear it referenced in a form of critique, or like, oh, Plato said this, and
Right.
it sounds like what you're describing is the whole thing is a little bit tongue in cheek. Like it's a little bit like Plato
Yes.
talking to a young man, being like, you don't want to get involved in politics, and now we're going to spin this big yarn that's designed to dissuade you from the whole thing. This is not what we actually think the ideal society should be structured like, which is how I always
Yeah.
see it, that like it's some sort of model that everyone has critiqued over time to lead to the society we're in. It sounds like you're
Right.
describing that that's not the case or the intention of it at
Well,
all, and this was in your podcast as well.
exactly. Well, the characters themselves, Socrates and Adeimantus and Glaucon, eventually decide, well, this city would inevitably, break down. This could never work in real life,
Right. Yeah, of
um,
course.
naturally. But it's the framing that's important, and the Iliad and the Odyssey were so powerful in the classical Greek era. If you read Socrates' Apology, Socrates directly compares himself to Achilles, as a
Hmm.
hero, which is a pretty bold thing to do.
Yeah.
Um, and and these heroes were so important to the Greek life that someone like Plato could not have missed any significance of the allusions that you make to these sorts of stories, and they're so um for lack of a better word, I hate to be crass, but they're so obvious. Um, having
So
read
crass.
the the
Flip.
the Iliad and the Odyssey in depth, they're so blatantly obvious, and I guess
Hmm.
but it's a testament to Plato's skill that they're easy to forget even when you know to look for them, because he's
Hmm.
so good at drawing the reader into this sort of almost hypnotic back and forth that he has Socrates do with Glaucon to draw him into the conversation. But to your point about Plato not saying anything definitively, the characters contradict themselves in the context of the conversation itself. At one
Hmm.
point they say, well, we would need warriors who hate strangers but love our own city folk. Well, it's
Hmm.
like, well, but how could we have someone who loves and hates in that same way? I guess it's impossible. And they feel like they've been stumped. And then Socrates is like, wait a second, puppies are like that. And so like it's this constant back and forth of contradiction and counter argument. And does this counter argument work? No, it doesn't. And of course, as I mentioned before, the arguments, when you look at them objectively, they're not just self-contradictory. They're so obviously self-contradictory, it's actually funny. Like, it's
Hmm.
once you understand how much Plato is relying on Homer in his worldview, in his pointing out how Odysseus chooses the right path at the end, but
Hmm.
immediately preceding that, he's like, well, we would need to censor Homer too. Like, we would
Yes.
need to keep Homer out of this. And like a Plato of today would be like, and we would need to censor Plato, of course, as well. Like, we would be
Naturally.
we would need to censor needless dialogues that might confuse people who don't understand them.
Hmm.
It's amusing and playful, and the purpose is to get people to look for those contradictions themselves, which is all
Hmm.
Socrates is doing in that conversation anyways.
That's
um
incredible.
yeah,
Well,
and it's
well,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. Oh, well, I mean, like that's the impression that I've gotten of repeated exposures to critique of Plato's Republic, is that what he actually ends up describing is this, infinitely complex kind of societal machine that must be held in place by very strict controls that no human society could actually reproduce. That what he, in the
Right.
way that it's framed, is that he's advocating for this crazy hyper structured society. And
Yeah.
to hear you tell it, it's like, yeah, there's no way that Plato would actually do that. And that's always conflicted with my understanding of Plato. It's like Plato doesn't seem like that kind of authoritarian. Like he just
Yeah.
doesn't seem like he's very much about open dialogue and questioning. So why would he build a society that you're unable to question it? That just seems very
For
counterintuitive to who he was.
for context to anyone who might listen to this who hasn't read the Republic or doesn't know what we're talking about, Plato advocates what we would today call the worst blend of fascism and communism. You know, like
Fair.
we have to lie to the public about virtually everything to keep them compliant, but we would never permit our own leaders, permit them to lie about anything, obviously, because that would be immoral.
Of
And
course.
what the warrior class, we would have to hold our wives in common. We couldn't have personal wives because that would create conflicts of interest, and so this way no one would know who their children would, and we would have an equal obligation to everyone. And we would have to do away with music. We would have to have like strict oversight of the creation of art, and in fact all crafts. And and the person running this city would have to be incredibly wise, just the wisest of the wise, whose knowledge is impossible for the public. Oh, and Socrates, the justice of the city is like the justice of the man, right? Yes, exactly. Okay, so anyways, back to our censorious city where no one's allowed to know anything.
Right.
It's when you step back, it is so self-contradictory. It becomes fun to read, and that's one of the things that makes Plato so easy to come back to and so easy to enjoy. It's very easy to read philosophers like Kierkegaard or Nietzsche or Sartre or Hegel or Heidegger, and to be like, Kant is probably the worst. It's just so it's so complicated, and it's so I couldn't say this about Nietzsche, but so like direct and serious about everything. And Plato really is fun.
Yeah, he
um,
is. Can
he's fun,
confirm.
and I would not have even had this view had I not been diving so deeply into Homer, for the last last 10 years, but really the last 2 or 3 years. But once you see that, it becomes more visible, and you can with that, I guess, like I was saying before, that mental connection makes understanding a little bit more possible, and hopefully makes the reader a little wiser. But not if they don't have that mental connection. Then they go off and write books like The Open Society instead.
Yeah, I mean, this. I was kind of thinking this. Like, is it possible that the men like Karl Popper who have critiqued Plato from this position, is it possible that they haven't been able to communicate with him because they haven't been through the body of shared suffering? Let's say that he has. Not to say what his shared suffering might be, but it's like they don't. Karl Popper, academic, professor, philosophy, very particular way of living that probably does not map to the way Plato was living. So Plato will communicate in such a way that Karl Popper or whoever is just not going to pick up on. They're not going to get the irony of it. They're not going to be able to laugh at it. They're going to take it way too seriously because they've never been punched in the face, as my buddy KJ might have said.
Yes, exactly. There's a very big difference between the classicists of, let's say, the 19th century and the classicists of today. In I'll be crass again, in physiognomy. Just you can just kind of look at them.
Post
There's
physique.
the most famous. If you ask any Homeric scholar who the most famous Homeric scholar is, they're going to say Albert Lord, and his student whose name escapes me at the moment. Not a very good sign of fame, I know, but Albert Lord went around the mountains of Eastern Europe with hauling this giant vinyl recorder with him, and recorded thousands upon thousands of hours of local like bards performing their songs. And he wrote this huge track. This is a dude who's like running around the mountains with like gun-toting locals on goats to hear their music and to compare it to each other and to see if this has anything to do with poetic traditions of the past like Homer. And he found that in fact they did. And he's the author of this composition and performance idea, that these lines were not memorized, but that you had a dictionary collection of lines that would all fit together, and the poet or the bard would literally be creating a new version of the poem as he performed it while performing it. And this was revolutionary at the time. And this is a dude who, as you say, was kind of off in the wilderness doing things, not like a journalist, sniping Twitter for something to repeat.
Hmm.
Which one gets the sense that a lot of modern scholars, not just in the classics, but you know, scientists and scholars in general, like why do an original research project when I can just do a meta analysis and take a bunch of other people's things and repackage it, and
Right.
you can get very stagnant that way very quickly.
It's a sort of the brain in the box phenomenon where it's
Yeah,
like you get someone who gets so deep into a project, or studies, and they live it behind a desk and they never actually
right.
get out there into the world to experience anything. And that lack of embodied knowledge, that lack of any sort of applicable skill feeds back. Go ahead.
Right. To your point, I lost the point there. To your point, not only are those people who are repeating things going to miss out on the experience of new things, they're not even going to be able to properly understand the things that they're repeating because they didn't
Right.
do the things that those uh, more courageous scholars before them did.
Yeah. So
So
yeah. So someone like Albert Lord is going around with a recorder. What year was he studying in? Oh, the 20th century, some
I
point.
want to say the 1920s.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
don't quote me on that. It might be later. It might have been in the 40s actually, because there were some very funny Greek stories he caught of from One, from World War I, I believe, that were only 15 or 20 years old and already wildly divergent from what historians had actually documented. He's like, I
Yes.
don't think these are historical accounts we're dealing with here.
He was 8 feet
So
tall and he sprayed lead from his eyes. No, I mean
yeah,
that's really bold, groundbreaking research in proof of a point.
right.
It speaks to an age of adventure that I think men don't really experience anymore. Go ahead.
And it really shattered the almost you know spiritual connection that a lot of people thought they had with Homer as this sort of archive of the true events of the past that had
Oh,
been
sure.
held prior to that. And if you don't view Homer's primary contribution as this story, not just the story, but the storytelling medium, the manner in which we can tell stories to each other, which was itself fairly new at the time, um, it would be easy to be very disillusioned and to feel
Hmm.
like your worldview had been shattered.
Mm.
Whereas, if you were a bard traveling around as Homer did to make money, you probably wouldn't feel that way.
Hmm.
One would imagine.
Well, when I sat down to read the Iliad, well, I think it was last year, 2020, something like that. I read the introduction to the book. It was some new translation. I didn't particularly favor it, but I mean, I know there are so many different versions. But it really stressed this point that the uniqueness of Homer's writing was not in it being a historical account. It was in how the thing was constructed. When
Yes.
you actually understand that this was how this great poem was performed, almost extemporaneously, with pre-made things, pre-made lines and segments that are repeated. So you have a minute to rehearse that before you figure out what the next thing is and these patterns, and to really be able to
Mhm.
step into the glory of the performance of it. And I felt that in reading that, that's so much more enjoyable for me to be able to imagine that than to take it as some sort of literally true historical account.
Oh, absolutely. And the depth of that creative process is such that my wife got me this book from the 1860s, I want to say. It was a commentary on Homer's Iliad in the Greek about how the Greek used in Homeric epic was not a version of Greek that was ever spoken by anyone. And
Mm-hmm.
that was because some of the lines borrowed from, was it Aeolic? From I don't remember offhand, but some of the words were borrowed words. And so the poet had to choose in translating it to his local vernacular, do I change the entire line in order to accommodate translating these certain words, or do I just keep the words as is and cross this, like essentially like you know using French in the English language to make
Mm-hmm.
a line fit better? And they just stuck with it, and certain lines have completely borrowed Greek that were not used in that vernacular,
Hmm.
and it creates its whole own system, which I'm sure as a poetic experience would have been like a strange mixture of normal English and Latin Vulgate at mass or something like that.
Right. It's like Spanglish a little bit.
Right? Yeah, and
So
that
one,
creative process. Anyways, go ahead.
yeah, no. So I wanted to actually go back to something that you said earlier about the Odyssey and the Iliad because it reminded me. It reminded me of an experience that I had in a Buddhist meditation retreat. And you talked about the Iliad is very much about wrath and heroism, and the Odyssey is very much about the man. Achilles famously makes the decision to be a hero and to never have a wife and kids or family. And Odysseus' whole story is just about trying to get home to his wife and kids and family. And in fact,
Desired
I,
nostos. Yeah.
yeah, and also like Hector is also the family man who is defeated by the pure warrior of Achilles, and it's sort of, and I love the juxtaposition of these three powerful characters of the choices that a man has to make in his life. What is he? What are you going to be? What are you going to pursue? Because these things are somewhat at odds. You know, the notion
Yes.
of being the transcendent hero often, in some sense, comes at the expense of a wife and kids, right? And
Right.
this this showed up in a Buddhist meditation retreat. And I'll bring this up because someone sent me a question. I don't remember who, a long time ago, about is this choice, is it a false choice or is it a real choice? So at this Buddhist meditation retreat, this Vipassana meditation retreat in the mountains of Kashmir, it was 10 hours of Buddhist meditation a day for 10 days, silent meditation retreat. It was wonderful. It was wonderful. So it was this very austere environment. Very rigorous schedule, up at 4 a.m. to meditate for 2 hours, and then, breakfast silent, and then an hour of meditation, and then 2 hours. And so it's structured like that for 10 days. And I achieved some pretty profound states of consciousness during that retreat, which lends some credence to the Buddhist notion of attaining enlightenment. That if you spent your lifetime doing this, you would eventually find your way out of samsara. Not to advocate on behalf of Buddhism, but to find your
Right.
way out of samsara and enlightenment and merge with all that is, or something like that. So the thing is, it's not actually possible to have a life if you do that. That's all you're doing. That's all you're
Right.
doing. And so that path is directly counteropposed to the path of the householder, which is the man who has a wife and kids and family and a business. And so and not every man is called down the path to meditate for 10 or 12 hours a day.
Right.
Most men are actually called down the path to actually be householders. And so I got a question from someone on Instagram a long time ago, asking about this very notion of, is it possible to blend, being this transcendent warrior, excellent? He didn't mean specifically in a warrior sense. He meant some specific pursuit with being a householder. Can a man walk
Yes.
both those paths? And it sounds like Homer was addressing that very question in a way.
Yes. The the answer I saw in Homer's work, and this is somewhat interpretive, so people will have to take it with the grains of salt they think it's worth. Um, Odysseus was, reluctant though he may have been, on the heroic path. He
Mm-hmm.
went out with the Achaean warriors and fought at Troy. He was primarily responsible for the sacking of Troy, of course, so the story goes. And when he gets home, he has to deal with all of these suitors, all of these
Mm-hmm.
men who did not go
Love that
off to
scene.
fight, who
Yeah.
stayed at home and who lacked the mental connection to recognize who the hell they were dealing with when this old beggar
Yeah.
came back in.
Yeah.
And they lacked the mental connection of their own island nation to know what was right and proper in how to treat each other, how to treat a
Mm-hmm.
guest, or how to act as a guest towards a host. And so and Telemachus could not wake up to his new, more manly personality until he had this mental connection with his father. Which, was that
Yes.
just a thought? No, he had to go out. He had to get in the boat and go off to Sparta. He had to go off and visit the places his father went to try to find him. And it was that departure, that going through the motions of of heroic initiation. And without that, one could argue you cannot even become a man, an archetypal
Yeah.
man, if you haven't gone through that heroic phase. So as far as, how do I choose between these two? Well, it's kind of you can't have the man without the hero.
Mm-hmm.
And you can now you can be a hero and be unlucky. And so you
Right.
never become the homeowner, um the Odysseus who gets to return home. It's also possible that you are a respected homeowner and circumstances require you to be a hero,
Mm-hmm.
um like Hector. And I mean, if you do a decent job of it, even if you and your whole family are killed, an entire order of warriors for 1,500 years might follow in your stead.
True.
This is a consolation of sorts.
Mm-hmm.
you know um but that outcome was probably out of your control to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
So there is still some consolation to the offer of immortality that poetry offers, teases with, one might say, because
Mm.
um the Odyssey is full of metaphorical temptations. The sirens are offering to sing to Odysseus about the Battle of Troy, about his own exploits, and he
Mm.
has to sail past them. Polyphemus, the one-eyed monster in the cave. Polyphemus means many stories. The name means many stories. And of
Mm.
course, the one-eyed giant is, you could say a metaphorical represent. I hope I'm not sounding too much like Jordan Peterson here. Um,
It's
a
okay.
sort
Well,
of metaphorical representation of the larger than life hero. Achilles is described as larger than life in the text, uh, who is single-mindedly focused on achieving his kleos,
mm-hmm.
his glory. And that single-minded focus is the opposite of this many-sided, complicated Odysseus, who can wear many hats and speak in different ways to different people in order to achieve his nostos. And so
Yes.
the temptations of heroism are something to be not avoided entirely, but you have to balance it very well. And there's an excellent Ainos given by um, one of the older characters in the Iliad when he's telling his son how to win a chariot race at Patroclus' funeral. He says, when you're coming around, and he takes great time and detail to describe exactly the way to bring your chariot around this marker so that you don't crash and burn on the inside, but so you don't lose and fall out on the outside either. And the thing that they're racing around is a tomb to an unknown hero from ages past. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like the perfect Ainos to close the Iliad on.
I like this the single mindedness. That's a really good distinction because the way that the way that this person who wrote into me framed it was around specifically the choice of, I think he wanted to be some sort of fighter or something like that. Because I remember talking about like Conor McGregor, and did Conor McGregor lose a step when he had kids or something like that. Not that this wasn't a question that I could answer, but I understood what he was saying. And
Mm-hmm.
and so when you say that single-mindedness versus many-mindedness, I think that captures it, because it would be really easy to sort of let's say, in the words of Dr. Shanti Smith, operationalize it in terms of the choice between self and family, or monk and householder. But really
Mm-hmm.
it's the choice is about single-mindedness versus many-mindedness. Like, are
Right.
you wired towards single? Not every man is wired towards single-mindedness, but there is a place for it in every man's life. But are you going to make that single-mindedness your life? That's the other question.
Right.
Or do you go through phases of single-mindedness, and then do you transition into many-mindedness? Or can you hold that line and decide, no, I will be single-minded forever, which some
Yeah.
men are, I think, naturally wired for, but a very small percentage, which is the point that I made to him.
Right. And it's, I mean, out of the classics and into experience, you know, there are times in your life where it's very, very useful to be able to shut out, negative thoughts and distractions that would distract you from doing something that's very important, whether
Right.
that's, you know, saving someone's life or saving your own life, or just doing your job well and not getting distracted by something that's getting you down or depressing you or what have you. Um, but it's very easy to, conversely, uh, get so focused on being tunnel vision that you lose sight of what's around you. And you can't even do that one thing because, you neglected some obstacle that was coming from your right. And
Mm-hmm.
so even to achieve that one thing, if there's only one thing you want, you have to be looking in many directions anyways, which is why
Mm-hmm.
Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Greeks, Greg Nodge has another book called the Greatest of the Achaeans, which is about who was actually greater. Was it Achilles or Odysseus? The man who most wanted to be there to win glory and who was the greatest fighter was not able to sack Troy. It was the
Hmm.
guy who didn't want to be there, but who was able to think from many perspectives, from many angles, and was
Hmm.
playing all those angles at once so that he could get home, who was able to eventually sack the city with the Trojan horse. And
That's
so
really interesting.
the breakdown of is it better to be one or the other is I think you're right. There's a time and a place for both, but as a holistic man in the full scope of what it means to be a man as described and idealized by Homer, you have to you have to be um you have to be both. I wanted to say many minded, but Odysseus is so single mindedly set on getting home that
Yes, exactly.
it's sort of a false dichotomy, I suppose.
Yes. Well, that's there was something I wanted to say into that that just kind of flew out of my mind, and maybe it will fly back in. But just to I do like the idea of false dichotomies, that maybe that's not the best way, because it can be very easy to collapse all thinking into binaries. Is it this way, or is it that? Oh, it was about Homer. It was about Odysseus and Achilles. The notion like, well, okay, so Achilles is like full send glory and isn't actually able
Mm,
to accomplish, his aim, versus, I will die on this hill. Let's frame it that way. And you
right.
have Odysseus was like, actually, no, I kind of want to live and get home to my wife. And so maybe he's like, maybe we can figure out a more creative strategy than just brute force, full frontal assault at it, and figure out something that may actually be effective. And I think
Mm,
that's a very powerful lesson, that because I think Thumos would drive many men to, like I said, I'm going to die on this hill, full,
yeah.
versus like, well, let's dial that back a little bit and see if we can let's see if we can find the smarter way to do it.
Yeah. And the particular danger of heroism, our friend Jack Donovan has described in the past, young men who are, fiery and full of passion are, on the one hand, very, very lovable. It's a great energy to be around people like that. And you can't help but like, high energy driven guys.
Yeah.
But they can be very easy to wind up and send in a direction that's advantageous to someone else.
Yes.
And it's
Amen.
something that it's not hard to see examples of it around. And so it's both things are double edged. I shouldn't leave people hanging with the idea that being a man is so much infinitely better than being a hero, because the hero dies and the man lives. There are many points in the Odyssey where, at least two I can think of offhand, where Odysseus says something to the effect of, "Oh, if only I could have just died on the battlefield, so at least people would remember me, rather than being stuck here like dead at sea or alone
Mm-hmm.
in this island or something forever." And it's not too hard to imagine of an alternative reality in which that happened. I'm sure there are many instances in the world of men suffering, ignoble fates like that, where they could have chosen glory but instead died as unknowns without even their return home.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a it's a tough line to walk between, perhaps Homer's most famous metaphor, between Charybdis and Scylla, the six-headed monster and the whirlpool.
Mm-hmm. The Odyssey is the one that I have read, and I was on a sailing adventure. I've done quite a bit of traveling. I was on a sailing adventure through the South Pacific, and so I read books. I read books about the ocean. So I read Moby
Mm-hmm.
Dick. I read Robert Louis Stevenson, Treasure Island, and I read the Odyssey. And to hear you describe these stories in this metaphorical way really brings it to life, because I, you know, in reading the bits of the Iliad that I have, I find it to be very grounded and square and violent and aggressive. And the bits of it that I've read, and I found the Odyssey to be quite a bit more fantastic and a bit more playful, quite a bit more playful, and a bit more, I guess a bit more round. I guess I would describe it, and
Yes.
I really appreciated like the contrast of that they would be that those two great works would come from the same poet, and to hear you describe these, you know, these adventures and misadventures that Odysseus gets into really helps bring it to life as a metaphorical tale, and a bit less like, no, this is actual historical fact.
Yes, exactly. And your description there reminded me of my absolute least favorite quote about the Iliad I ever or Odyssey I ever heard. Adam Nichols, who I can't recommend highly enough, his Why Homer Matters, was giving some talk, and he was being interviewed by, of all people, like the Cambridge chair of Greek studies, or someone who should have known better than to say something that they're about to say. And this academic said, well, the Iliad was clearly written by a superior intelligence, because there's the opening line sums up the entire plot, and it's so grand, and then it plays out exactly like that, and it's so brilliant, whereas the Odyssey is just one damn thing after another. And I remember him saying
What?
that, and it was like it it, it it's a could not be more wrong. It's the Odyssey begins in the middle. The Odyssey begins with Odysseus already, shipwrecked and alone on an island, and then the gods are like, "Well, it's time to do something about him." And then we go, forward a bit without even seeing Odysseus, and then we have to go back and hear the story of what happened before, and it's all over the place, but it all weaves together in this very complicated story that matches the complicated man. Whereas it's the Iliad that's one thing that happens after another in
Wow.
chronological order. And it's maybe another point of that noos and the failures of academics for lack of mental connection with their writers. I'm sure it's very hubristic of me to say this, because I have not you know spent time in Greece. My Greek is limited to certain words that are important to the Iliad
Mhm.
and the Odyssey, of course. So there's but that's one of the great things about studying the classics is it is a bottomless well of knowledge and fascinating points of connection. And I think the thing that got me about that professor, I have the quote in the book because it was worth immortalizing, um, but was the audacity and the certainty with which he just said, "Oh, this was such a dumb book by comparison."
Mhm.
And I would agree with your view entirely. Yes, the Odyssey is a circular book. It's about coming back. Right?
Mhm.
The whole concept of nostos, which is so critical and etymologically related to noos as well, interestingly, um, is that returning to home. Um, it's not just going to a new place. It's circling back.
Renewed, because that
Mm-hmm.
closing scene in the palace with Telemachus and so Penelope and the suitors and the great bow, and
Yeah.
I guess historians still haven't been able to reconstruct what it was that he did, what it was he shot through. Like they just don't really know, but they
Yeah.
get
Was
that
it
it
the
was, yeah.
axe heads, or was it the holes where the axes get their shaft, or who knows?
It's
Yeah.
just it's such a triumphant scene, because you suffer with this man through these frustrations, like, oh my God, another thing, another thing. Well, and that's the power of the story, right? The man
Mm-hmm.
trying to get home. And we've all been in that experience. Like maybe we won't all get to be glorious heroes dying and having songs written about us on the battlefield like Achilles, right? But all of us can appreciate the struggles of just struggling to get home, whatever home is, whether it's our
Yeah.
actual home or just do the damn thing. How many movies, how many comedy movies are made about the guy trying to get home? And there's something Odyssean, is that even a word? Homeric, I suppose,
Yeah.
about planes, trains, and automobiles is Homeric in nature.
Yeah, exactly. And the value of it isn't even just for yourself either. I mean, we all remember and know the scene of Odysseus and Telemachus together killing the suitors. But the last heroic killing in the Odyssey is not done by uh, Odysseus or Telemachus. After they've slain all the suitors, um, you know, the local Ithaca villagers are quite upset about them butchering their kids. So they've gotten together and they're going to go fight this, Telemachus and Odysseus and his household. And who should join the party but Laertes, Odysseus's father, who's this
Mm-hmm.
old, disheveled man. He's beyond heartsick about losing his, son at sea years ago, only to have him come back as
Mm-hmm.
this glorious man and
Yeah.
retake his household. And he is just a new person. He's been reinvigorated. And so, anyways, the three of them are with their household servants marching off to meet these other Ithacans who are wanting to kill them. And he's hearing his son, uh, you know, basically remind his grandson that we Ithacans are great warriors and don't shy away in battle. And they're basically trying to one up each other, this father and son combo.
Mm-hmm.
And he's, making his grandfather heart swell to hear his young boys talk like this. But then when the actual battle begins, only one spear is thrown, and it's Laertes who throws the spear
Mm-hmm.
and gets right through the forehead of the father of the chief suitor, who had
Mm-hmm.
been causing trouble previously too. And then Athena intervenes and says, "Let's not do this." But he this old man who had never done anything notable aside from helping build this household is you know now gets a heroic passage precisely because of the transformative power of his son's homecoming. And the power of the hero in the Iliad and the Odyssey
Yeah.
is not necessarily for the benefit of the hero, but for everyone around them.
Mm-hmm. That's just, it makes me think in so many different directions about the power of when we redeem ourselves, when we go on our own transformative journey, when we do set out on this grand adventure and do perhaps even try to be the transcendent hero. If
Mm-hmm.
we achieve even the smallest measure of our aim with honor and integrity, when we come back, I mean, this, we are renewed. And this is the classic Campbell hero's journey, to go
Right.
on the hero cycle. And then the magical flight home for Odysseus is quite a bit longer than it is in other epics, because it's kind of the trip that shapes him. But he comes
Mm-hmm.
back, and yes, the house is a mess, and the suitors are pursuing his wife, and she's kind of beginning to weaken a bit in her resolve, as my husband coming home, he doesn't have text message or email, and his son is floundering, and his grandfather is withering, and even his dog, which is like one of the best parts of the Odyssey, the dog,
Dude,
man.
this still makes me cry. Give one
Yes.
wag and then dies.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like, but it's such a very heartfelt portrayal of what it means to be a man, in a
Mm-hmm.
very well-rounded way, in a way that isn't quite portrayed in the Iliad, probably intentionally, in a way, because you can look at that single-minded hero of Achilles and see the way that he's lionized in the end, that he ultimately comes to, versus this man who has been on his own adventure, not quite to the same degree of eternal glory, but is able to have a
Yeah.
broader experience of life and touch more lives in the process directly, as opposed to through song.
Exactly. Well, the men, the archetypal men, the Nestors, the um, phoenixes of the Iliad are so overshadowed by the fury and the energy of the young heroes. There, it's like Nestor tries to talk sense into Achilles and Agamemnon, and they're both just still angry. Phoenix tries
Mm-hmm.
to talk Achilles into reconciling, and he's just not having any of it. When Chryseis tries to talk to Agamemnon, he says, be gone and don't come back or I'll kill you, basically. And these old men are essentially powerless to save these young men from themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And only once does a man manage to break through, and that's at the very end of the Iliad, perhaps the best known scene from the Iliad, when Priam manages to sneak into the Achaean camp and ask Achilles for the body of his son back. But he doesn't do that by just berating him in the way of Nestor saying, "Oh, I was around when the warriors were greater than you." He does it.
Right.
He does it by reminding Achilles of his own father. And he says, "Think of your own father at home and how much he misses you and how he'll never see you again. Think now of me and my son that I can see and will never see alive again." And he in that instant created a connection between himself and Achilles' father. And Achilles, he just killed Hector and then dragged his body around the city, attempted to desecrate it. And Priam comes and asks for his body back, and Achilles begins to cry, thinking of his own father. That's how powerful that message was. And it's almost an introduction to the different mode of speech we see in the Odyssey, this ainos focus rather than the logos focus, because so much of the Iliad is these Bronze Age warriors challenging each other and taunting each other. Though, like,
Mm-hmm.
someone stabs a spear through someone's spleen and the person screams in pain and collapses to the ground, and they're like, "Ha, guess you won't be going home tonight." Like, they talk to each other that way.
They do.
They're like, it's brutal, and it's painfully direct, as direct in speech as was their direct attack on the city, which didn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And it is only by the indirect path, the Trojan horse, were they able to take the city, and it's only by the indirect path that the old men were able to persuade the young men to maybe not die so needlessly.
That's fascinating, because there is a component of like, is that indirect path, is that still masculine, right? In the way that we would talk about it today, like very
Yes.
clearly it is. They won the war, but it's like it's
Yes.
subterfuge, right? Like that's not
Mm-hmm.
masculine. I don't do
Right.
that.
We associate masculinity with directness, and this is quite explicit. One of the my favorite lines when I was 1920 reading the Iliad was the line where Odysseus, of all people, is trying to persuade Achilles to come back to fight in Book 9, and Achilles turns to him and says, "You basically don't talk to me. Like, more hateful to me than the gates of hell is the man who hides one thing away in his heart and utters another."
Mm-hmm.
And it captures exactly the heroic spirit of masculine language. This is
Mm-hmm.
how men are supposed to talk to each other, directly, out and out. And that's how Achilles speaks every time. And
Mm-hmm.
it's there is something noble about that. There's something attractive about that. Um, but the this brings you back to the challenge of language too, which is not just will the words have the effect that you desire, and like will the person do what I want them to do, but will they even understand me? you know
Mm-hmm.
and the direct speech is egocentric in the sense that I'm going to express myself in the words that I think are right, regardless of what those words might mean to the other person. And much misunderstanding and confusion comes out of that. you know and it's the same knowledge that permits Odysseus to speak directly when he wants to you know to shoot so straight he can shoot through axes, metaphorically speaking,
Mm-hmm.
is also what permits him to hide. And most of Odysseus's deceptions and lies are not manipulations in the sense of getting people to do things that he wants them to do. There are
Mm-hmm.
attempts to hide himself away.
It's a
He
trickster.
Yes, but he's not. But he's not caught. At least in the Odyssey, there are other apocryphal stories of Odysseus causing trouble. But in the Odyssey itself, he's for the most part not causing strife, not
Mm-hmm.
nearly to the degree that the direct men, Agamemnon and Achilles, are. He is
Mm-hmm.
actually the conciliatory guy for the
Mm-hmm.
most part.
Mm-hmm.
All of his deceptions and indirect speech are ways to keep himself out of the limelight so as not to suffer the fate of the direct men.
Concealment.
Right. He calls himself Otis, meaning no man, to
Mm-hmm.
Polyphemus when he asks, "Who is your name?" And so when they poke his eye out, he says, "No man has done this." And it's all very funny. But there's even a passage in the Iliad, the night raid chapter, I want to say chapter 10, where Diomedes and Odysseus go out, and Diomedes is asked to choose the best of the Achaeans to go out with him. And Diomedes turns to Odysseus and says, "Well, Odysseus is clearly the best." And Odysseus says, basically, "Don't speak lies. Don't talk to me that way. We everyone here knows I'm not the best, but I'll go with you anyways." But always trying to shun the spotlight, shun the Kleos in many ways that the heroes were so drawn to like moths to a light.
I'm really enjoying this because in this whole masculine space which we co-inhabit, there does seem to be quite a lot of celebration of Achilles and his directness and his warrior glory and that whole and all thing through the people that are familiar with literature and the classics. And I don't see a lot of discussion of Odysseus really at all. And the
Yeah,
picture that you're painting is like maybe there's a lot more that men have to learn from this man about who we actually. I don't want to say who we actually are because who's to say, but
right.
that is a more rounded
Many sided.
portrayal. Yeah, exactly. That's a more well-rounded portrayal, many-sided of
Mm-hmm.
who men are that we could actually maybe draw more from than the single-minded thematic iconic warrior. Like maybe there's a lot for us to look into there.
Yeah. I would tend to agree. My go-to model of masculinity, I think this is increasingly the universal model, is Jack Donovan's
I knew you were going
tactical
to say that.
virtues: strength, courage,
Shout out to
mastery. Oh,
Jack Donovan.
they're so direct. They're so straightforward, as it
Yes.
were. DK is the Greek word that direct, which also means just. Interestingly,
Mm.
um, and but part of mastery is being able to do things that other people don't understand. Was it John Arthur C. Clarke who said that sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic?
Yep.
People don't like indirect or artful speech because it's um you feel like you're being manipulated, and sometimes you are. you know
Yeah.
it's hard to understand, it's hard to comprehend, and it's and people do use it for evil. No question about it.
Yeah.
But to go the other way and say, well, sometimes this is used for bad, therefore it's unmanly to do it, is that's
Mm.
an attitude that can lead to pacifism and to all kinds of other troubles. Aristotle in Rhetoric famously said that some people say that rhetoric is to be avoided because people use it to mislead, but that a virtue can be used for poor ends can be said of all virtues aside from virtue itself. So it can be said of strength. A strong person
Yeah.
can bully someone else, but that doesn't mean strength is evil. And
Mm-hmm.
it's you know I have in the last several years come to question the value of philosophy. Like, why is this worth doing, especially after reading Mishma? um,
Right.
it's very
Yes.
easy to see the dangers of becoming too much of a person of the word and not enough of a person of the sun and steel, one might say.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the great values, though, of studying that is you're a little bit better able to see it. You're a little bit able to identify bullshit. And
Mm-hmm.
while many men might say, well, it's not very manly to speak so indirectly, I think it is every bit as unmanly to be, I won't say unmanly. I would say it's not particularly manly to be easily used, to call back to a previous comment, to be the sort of person who is easy to spin off, wind up, and push in a direction that you did not choose.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
there isn't much of a distinction between knowing how to speak in this indirect way, having the mental connection to speak well, and also recognizing when you're being manipulated or wound up in that direction, which is
Mm-hmm.
particularly important in today's media age, shall we say.
Mm-hmm. I find myself wondering if I had this thought later, and we've kind of come back to it. If a lot of the value, and I think it's pretty self-evidently true now that I'm about to articulate it, but if a lot of these values that we seem to espouse today in this masculine space are in fact they're reactionary in the sense of like men are celebrating Achilles and wanting glory because we have no room for glory in our lives, and in that pursuit we lose sight of the larger picture. And in the same way, men react to the notion of say subtlety of speech as being unmanly because we are surrounded by such propaganda, such venomous propaganda all the time. That's like, no,
Mm-hmm.
just speak to me directly. And that's why reading the Tactical Virtues is so powerful. Every time the first man reads it, is it cuts to the quick about what it means to be man, and does and always will in this really refreshing way that most men don't ever get. And at the same time, glory and directness aren't the end of the story. and
Yeah,
and and where do we turn for those models of like, here's how these are tools to use in a complete man's arsenal, but don't discount the value of the other ones.
yeah. Well, the argument I make, this is sort of a tangent, but I think it's related. The real value of direct speech, and I think that the subconscious desire why thumotic young men want direct speech is that if you want to be immortalized in language, you have to have direct speech.
Yeah.
No one's going to remember the metaphorical character who might be a stand-in for something in this indirect, beautiful story about something else. That's no longer even about you. What
Mm-hmm.
would it mean to be immortalized in that way? You know, direct speech is the path to immortality through speech, and so it's existentially
Love it.
necessary um, if you are a hero. But if your goal is not to be immortalized in poetry, if your goal is not to die on the battlefield so the songs of glory can be sung about you, if you are in fact fleeing from that as from sirens
Mm-hmm.
or Cyclops, um, there's nothing wrong with indirect speech in that way. In fact, that might be a better tool. It might be a stronger tool, a more masterful tool to reconnect with home, to reconnect with your honor group,
Mm-hmm. Mm.
if that is your goal. Um,
Yes. I want to throw a big but in there.
sure.
But I think what this what sort of comes up in me around this is having worked in the corporate world, and everything in the corporate world is indirect speech. The
Oh,
whole, yeah, yeah, okay. Circle back, touch
yeah.
base. It's all passive aggressive, indirect speech that
Yes.
has no actual violence to it, but it's actually dialectically violent. Like, we're going to circle back on that. And when you say that to somebody, you're not actually saying like, oh, we're going to come back to it later, like, because that would be direct speech. You're actually saying, I'm dismissing everything that you have to say, and it's not important, and we'll just deal. It's secondary, and you're secondary. And so
Yeah.
so like, it's separate. The big but is in the corporate environment, it's all indirect speech, and you're actually
It's soft
penalized for
speech. Yeah.
direct speech. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. It's corrosive, it's destructive. You have to deprogram it. So, but other than that, yes, because I think in some circumstances, really, like, I spent a lot of time like, why was I miserable in the corporate environment? Because I spent so long learning to write and learning to communicate directly, and clear thinking is clear writing, etc. But you go into the corporate world, that is not appreciated at all in the workplace environment. So, like,
Right.
how to pull that out of myself. So yes, in personal endeavors, indirect speech can be very useful, and we'll just let the corporate world kind of burn over there with its own problems.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the the value of direct speech is most profound among friends and family, kith and kin,
Mm.
right? And
Mm-hmm.
even Odysseus speaks plainly eventually with his son and his father and his wife. It takes a while to feel everything out, make sure the context is right to come out in the open like that. But
Mm.
the hero, for the hero, direct speech is more of an absolute value. And I see people, for example, on social media who will say like, don't say "Let's go, Brandon." Just be direct and say "F Joe Biden." You know,
Right.
why beat around the bush and play to this language game? And like, on the one hand, fair enough, but when you the hero who wants to speak directly to everyone and cares more about his life in story than in his continued life on this earth. In fact, his continued existence and story is contingent on him dying. You know, um,
Mm-hmm. Mm.
there's no danger in your enemies understanding you directly. So you might
Mm-hmm.
die. Okay, I'm still going to speak directly. I'm still going to be straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm a young unattached man who has nothing to live for here. I have no family. I have no grandfather to lift out of his misery. I have no
Mm.
son
Mm.
to teach how to be a hero. I have no wife to come home to and, remind her of the effort I put into constructing our, marital bed, or anything like that. They have no attachments in this world. And so the prospect
Mm-hmm.
of death and the risks associated with direct speech are of no real consequence. They would rather die as heroic men than do what they have to do to actually be that man.
Mm-hmm.
And what Odysseus does is he has the ability to be direct. But when it comes to adversaries, to Cyclops who might want to eat him, he could have been direct and said, "I'm Odysseus and you're not going to eat us."
Right.
But instead he, treated him as the enemy that he was. What
Mm.
what is what is manly or advantageous? I shouldn't say that, because there is a kind of manliness in that heroism, and I don't want to take away from that. But I would not say it's unmanly to, you know, to hold back on and to not be forthright with enemies.
Mm-hmm.
There's no, what's the advantage other than some naive youthful idea of being immortalized in song to, like a misguided Bond villain explaining all of your plans to the person who wants to stop you. you know
It's self defeating, right?
yeah.
It's and
and,
this
and
is
but that is
go ahead.
exactly how the Bronze Age warriors talk to each other. They would meet on the battlefield and said, "I'm going to stab your spleen and steal your wife," and the other one says, "Not if I cut off your head and steal your daughters first." I'm exaggerating slightly, but
Sure.
they challenge
Slightly.
each other in this way. And
Yes.
it was there was a funny tangent where I believe it was Malcolm Gladwell was talking about David and Goliath. Goliath was, of course, a Mycenaean warrior, a Greek Bronze Age warrior of that era. And he would come out in the front of the battle lines and challenge all the Israelites in exactly this language. And the Israelites were not so much afraid of him per se, although he was described as pretty intimidating, as much as like just confused. Like, what do we do with this strange guy coming out here personally challenging us in this way? And then, of course, David comes out and says, "I'm not fighting for myself, but for God." And of course, the Mycenaeans are like, "What are you talking about? Like, this isn't
Right.
about that." Um, as a completely different frame. Um, and I wouldn't say that David is less manly than Goliath for that. Though I wouldn't want to detract from the manliness of Goliath either.
This kind of makes everything into this. I can see now, having been exposed to this in the way that you see it, and getting the chance to talk it through, just how low resolution some of our discussions about masculinity can become, in its reactionary kind of spirit. Like we live in this fallen and decaying empire of nothing. Shout out Jack Donovan again. And so it's hard, well deserved, and it's hard living in this context and not to want to choose a way of being that is 180 degrees diametrically opposed to
Diametrically
that. Just
opposite.
yeah, just out of instinct, and to say the empire of nothing has absolutely nothing valid to teach, because it employs all these techniques that are actually quite effective. And we don't
Right.
want to have anything to do with that. But it seems like, as long as we can do it very carefully, we can actually extract the things that are very useful. Like one of the things one of the things just real quick that I talk about is the empire of nothing has very limited, at least how it's manifesting right now, has very limited actual physical force, right? All the
Yes.
force is exerted through social shaming and pressure, right? There's no jackbooted thugs. It's all like proclamations and you're killing grandma and stuff like that. And that's just shame. And so
Right.
one of the things, but men don't fight with shame. We fight with
Yeah.
bullets and swords. It's very feminine. So we as men have to get better at shaming. We have to use that weapon, like turn it
Well,
right back around. Like, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. Oh, well, you know what?
yeah.
You're a coward,
Well,
and
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 you
that can
don't
be very
have
effective.
to, and you don't have to fully, you don't have to fully buy into your enemy's frame in order to, accept some of the truth behind what the enemy is saying. Nietzsche
Yes.
famously argued that, you have to choose your enemies carefully because you eventually become what you fight. And,
Yeah.
um, that's one of the reasons I stopped even thinking about Antifa, 4 or 5 years ago.
Right.
Is you don't, at some level, spiritual level, you don't want to even become like that. But,
Right.
that you're right that much of the modern discourse is about shaming, and men are right to not be shamed for the things that they um, are accused of very often. But
Yes.
conversely, there would be something wrong with a man who had no sense of shame.
Yeah. Shamelessness is a word
Yeah,
that we don't say anywhere, and it's a real thing.
right. And they're just called psychopaths. Uh, we don't.
In some sense, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's true of language too. And your comments reminded me of the Lord of the Rings, which has come back into the news in the last few months, and
Unfortunately.
they've come back into the news in the context of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of identical responses which say the exact same thing, which is a quote from the source that evil cannot create anything new; it can only corrupt and destroy what good is created. And of course,
So perfect.
the you know you would never look at something that has been corrupted like the Lord of the Rings and say, well, now we have to reject the original because that's what the other side does.
Mhm.
And I think that has to be our attitude with language as well. Unfortunately, the political left has almost via postmodernism almost claimed language itself as its own
Yes.
domain,
Yes.
which is of course nonsensical. The foundations for our language and for our means of emotional and cultural connections are in these hero cult stories that are, from times past. There's an inherently conservative nature to that, and the way we connect with each other is, at least in part, by connecting to these shared stories that we have together. Um, and while no one should be emulating to necessarily become exactly like Achilles, um, not least because of Achilles' own advice on the matter, that familiarizing yourself with these old stories and learning the language of the stories, the morally thick language that they talk about, is and here, honestly, one of the best people who's begun talking about thick language again is a British commentator named Carl Benjamin. Perhaps some of your viewers will know him.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
Sargon
Yeah.
of Akkad.
Yeah.
Uh, another heroic reference just in his old pseudonym.
Right.
Um,
He doesn't
but
look the
yeah,
part, but
well, he's come around. He's been posting videos of pull-ups and the
Oh wow.
works. Yeah,
Good for
he's
him.
you wouldn't recognize him from 4 years ago. I'll say that.
Oh, well, great. Okay, awesome. I've heard similar stories about political commentators, but other ones. Please continue.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how much longer I can go here. I've got to get up at 4:30 tomorrow. So
No problem. Just one more question then, because
sure.
I've certainly been inspired by everything we've talked about with regard to the Greek classics, and I can imagine that many of my listeners and watchers have as well. What advice would you give to someone who's like, okay, I'm ready to pick up the Iliad and the Odyssey, and really ready to engage with it? What would you tell this person to do to begin giving a perspective that matches yours?
A perspective that matches mine.
Or
Well,
an experience. Let's say a rich, like, where would I go? Okay, I'm ready to read. Which translation do I read?
yeah.
What other resources should I? How can I have an experience of the Iliad like the one that you're describing, and the Odyssey for that matter?
Oh man. Well, the single best book I could recommend if reading is your way of understanding, as it was with mine, is I mentioned why Homer matters before, but the absolute best book, and I think it's accessible enough to most of your viewers, is called The Ancient Greek Hero in 24 Hours by Greg Naj. Um, Available online for free. You can find it on the Center for Hellenic Studies. Um,
Wow.
it's absolutely phenomenal, but it's I don't know. I think the best way of giving people my take would be to read, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey in the context of understanding Wittgenstein. That might sound like a kind of a random tangent, but Wittgenstein wrote two
We're gonna be
books.
here till 4:30. Here we go.
Yeah, sorry, I'll make it short.
No, no,
Wittgen,
please, no. Go ahead.
Wittgenstein wrote two books, a very pretentiously titled like philosophical tractatus, something really pretentious in his younger years, where he believed he had solved all of the problems of philosophy, and it was about language. And he said language is about painting pictures with words. And if you can paint pictures with words in another person's head, you can communicate. If you can communicate with language, literally all of our problems in philosophy are solved. And he wrote that, and it was considered a magnum opus. It was a very well known, very respected work. Um, and just as Homer's first work, the Iliad, was quite well known and well respected. But then Homer came back 20 years later and wrote a different book. And Wittgenstein comes around 20 years after his first book and writes a second book. And Wittgenstein's second book basically, in summary, argued maybe language isn't just painting pictures. Maybe language is actually a wide variety of different games that we play with each other. There are many different language games. And not games in the sense of like tricks or whatever, but games in
Yeah.
the Piagetian sense of there's tag and there's this. I can tell you a bullshit story that's literally just trying to pass the time and entertain. Comedy is a different language game than history, which is a different language game than formal debate. And
Hmm.
and you can't understand language outside of the context of these different language games, which is a
Love
sort
it.
of rediscovering the language philosophy of Ainos that Homer came to with the circular indirect passage of the Odyssey.
Hmm.
And
Do you have? Go ahead, please.
so I would say if you read Homer's Iliad and Odyssey in the context of Wittgenstein and thinking about the importance of the language itself, of the poems themselves as the most important part of the poem. Marshall McLuhan famously said that the medium is the message. I would say that's
Hmm.
eminently true of Homer's works, and you're not going to get the same thing out of watching Troy as you would out of reading these things.
Right.
Um,
Right. And I did appreciate you saying that, because you talked about the left corrupting all language, and the left is in Lord of the Rings especially is corrupting all of our myths, and we have to reach back deeper into the past to find those that are almost uncorruptible in their complexity, but we have to experience them for what they are.
well, and it won't stop them from trying. There's a
Mm.
Catherine Alexander. There's some Greek scholar out there trying to say that Achilles and Patroclus were gay lovers, and
It's
that
old. That's an old thing. Yeah.
the Song of Achilles, yes, and Circe is the more recent one. It's a sort of a feminist spin on the Odyssey, but they of course miss the thrust of these things for the same reason that Karl Popper misses the thrust of the Republic. And if you
Mm-hmm.
establish that mental connection with the source material, you'll be able to see through their indirect language, which passes itself off as direct language naturally.
Wow.
And it's very easy to fall for if you're
Mm.
not familiar with this, if you don't have that mental connection established. But it's there for the harvesting and enjoyment, and that's I think the main reason to study the classics, whether that's the Iliad and the Odyssey, or the Bible, or the Republic, or the Bhagavad Gita, or any of these ancient works of epic scale and skill in telling,
Mm.
is just the sheer enjoyment of them. You know,
Yeah.
when you compare it to the quick paced, dopamine hits and then back into the deepening depression of meaninglessness of modern entertainment, um, the sheer bottomless depths of these great works is such a more satisfying and nourishing use of time and
Mm-hmm.
attention, and of the short time that we have to appreciate things on this world.
Amen. That's beautiful. Thank you. I mean, mission accomplished because you just painted the picture for me that I wanted to see. So I really, I appreciate that, and I'm going to
Oh,
get out my
excellent.
copy of the Iliad now. Really, for sure. And I'll recommend your book, "The Hero and the Man," along with that to help add some context to everything that you just said, which I think is vitally important.
Well, thank you
So,
so much.
thank you. So, where can men go to find out more about you and what you do?
For the low res stuff, they can go to my blog, Caffeine and Philosophy, um, which is just where I play around with ideas at an even lower resolution on Instagram. Uh, Also, Caffeine and Philosophy. But my books are where I've put out what I hope are the better developed ones. So, In Defense of Hatred, it was the first foray into that. Letter to Onways, playing around with concepts of identity and is an individual the core being, or are we better understood as a transgenerational lineage of which we are only a part. Holy Nihilism is my attempted challenge to Christianity, and that was a fun one, and a challenging one. And The Hero and the Man is more of a labor of love, mostly because there's so much to love about Homer, and there's a special place in there for Christians too, where I argue that not Achilles, but actually Jesus is the ultimate Greek cult hero in
Mm-hmm.
history. Just
I was thinking that.
an extra little um, bit there, which I hope Christians can take some pleasure in.
I do. I had the same thought while we were talking, and I appreciate the directness of your writing. I'm reading Holy Nihilism right now. I'm really enjoying it. So,
Oh, good,
especially the
good.
skill in your writing. Yeah. Thank you very much. Well, this has been fantastic, CB. I really appreciate it. And thanks for all your time this evening.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.